My name is Ben Gerard. I'm the Regional Grain Marketing Leader in Alberta. As part of our Cargill Market Sense service, we provide information and insights to help you make better decisions on your farm, to help you manage risk and better understand the risk that you face. And for those of you who weren't able to attend our think tank sessions at the end of February and early in March of this year, wanted to go through an overview of one of the presentations, Clash of Currencies, and just share some of the information that we reviewed there. And hopefully this is going to provide you with the information that you need as you go into your grain marketing decisions in the year ahead. So we're going to hit on three topics today. One is how do currency markets work? Then we're going to go through trade wars, sanctions, stimulus, and agriculture, and what all that means to the world that you work in. And then we're going to take that information and we're going to apply it to your farm and help you with understanding how it all fits together. So before we get into it, I'd like to share a quote from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He wrote a book that I read called Anti-Fragile, just a fascinating book. And one of the quotes that really stood out to me was, injecting some confusion stabilizes the system. So this might seem counterintuitive to some of you in that we're injecting chaos into a system. How can that make the system stronger? But essentially what he's covering in that book and working through is that as we see uncertainty, as we see confusion or different unforeseen events come into either the markets or into governments and political systems or into our own lives, often what we'll do is we will react to them in a way that better prepares us for the future, that actually helps to increase the stability of the system overall. And that's very relevant to what we're going through here today around the currency markets. So what we'll cover first here is just how do currency markets work. So this is a brief overview of currency markets, and then we'll get into a little bit more of how that translates down to agriculture in Canada. So first off, there are about 180 commonly recognized currencies worldwide. So the UN is the body that is typically used to recognize the common currencies. Now, in that classification of major currencies, basically what we're going through is looking at which currencies the vast majority of global trade takes place, which ones are the most commonly used both inside their country as well as outside of their country. And almost all of these currencies have their values measured relative to the US dollar, and this includes the Canadian dollar. So basically the US dollar index is used as the benchmark, and then everyone else, when they quote their currency value, are quoting it against that benchmark. Now, there's three trade mechanisms that take place for the vast majority of these currencies. The first is free floating. So that's essentially where the currency can move up and down on its own, and it'll do that through either the buying and selling on the exchange, and that is typically impacted by everything from fiscal policy to monetary policy to the amount of trade taking place in that country. There's restricted currencies. So this is a currency that has a lot more rules on it. It's generally not freely traded to very, very large extent at all. And there's a lot of rules around where the currency can be used as well. And then the third type is a currency peg. And a currency peg is essentially where a country will pick a currency exchange value relative to another currency, often at either the same value or at a predetermined discount relative to it, and then it'll fluctuate to a minor extent within that range. Now, why do we talk about currency in agriculture? The first reason for it is that it significantly impacts the price of grain. So all of you will have seen this at times over the past number of years, where either basis was moving higher or basis was moving lower, and the reason given for that was the exchange rates taking place. And the reality is the currency markets move constantly and often move very quickly when there's new economic news coming out or there's changes being made in regards to stimulus or an interest rate decision. And as well, all of our commodities beyond canola that we are trading are traded on a futures exchange in U.S. dollars. So as these commodities are traded on these exchanges, so this wouldn't refer to the non-exchange traded commodities, but only the exchange traded ones. But as they're traded in U.S. dollars on these exchanges, what we're essentially doing is constantly converting that dollar value back into Canadian dollars. And where that shows up is in the basis price that you see, the Canadian basis value that we're seeing. And as well, you have to keep in mind that most of these commodities are also traded globally in U.S. dollars as well. So as countries, including Canada, see their exchange values go up or down, that is making their commodity either more expensive or less expensive to the countries that they're being sold to, or changing the value that an importer is able to buy at. So essentially, by following the currency markets, it can help us to better understand the demand for Canadian products and help us to make decisions on either the futures or basis components of our contracts. Now, I'm just going to go quickly through a few other things that have major impacts on the currency market. So the first is trade wars. So trade wars are actually something that have become talked about a lot more in the past few years here. And these essentially occur when a country decides that they want to put tariffs or some sort of restrictions on another country to protect parts of their own domestic economy, or in order to simply punish another country. So when they introduce a tariff, what they're often trying to do is they're trying to provide a competitive advantage to their own domestic producers or consumers of commodities or other sectors of the economy, or they're trying to create a competitive disadvantage to someone else. And obviously, when that happens, the common reaction is for the country that's being impacted by the tariffs to retaliate, which increases the trade war. And essentially that goes on until either one or both are looking at the next action they'd like to take and saying, this is going to cause more damage to either our domestic economy or to the goals that we had than we're going to get as a benefit for it. So it can at times create opportunities, because what can happen is major producers look for lower cost markets. For example, when the U.S. introduced some tariffs against China, it drove initially some of the Chinese demand to Canada and allowed increased canola exports at the time. The next one is sanctions that I'd like to hit on. So economic sanctions, this is basically when a country is going to disallow trade or disallow the use to either some extent or entirely of world financial markets. And essentially what they're trying to do in this case is they're trying to alter the policies or the behaviors of a country that is being targeted by this. So one example of it, very common, well-known one, is Cuba, for example, where there's a sanction applied to their entire economy. We've also seen them against North Korea, Iran, a number of other countries that the U.S. have done. And these are actually taking place around the world at times and are impacting the amount of trade that's taking place, as well as sometimes the currency values of either the countries that export to them or the countries that are directly impacted by the sanctions. So the next one I'd like to cover is stimulus. Just a brief overview of this, and this has become something quite common recently, is that central banks will, when necessary, either change their interest rate. So often, if they're trying to stimulate the economy, interest rates will be lowered, making it easier for people to borrow or companies to borrow, or by simply injecting money into the economy. So by printing additional money, they can stimulate targeted areas of the economy or the economy as a whole. And often what happens is as money is printed, it can impact the value of that country's currency. So if someone prints too much, or if a country prints too much of a currency, it can lower the value of the currency overall. And if that's not kept in check, it can essentially cause inflation long term, or some other negative impacts. Although they're not very well quantified yet. We don't fully know what all of the impacts are of stimulus, even though we do see some of those impacts showing up on a basis across the Western world right now, as we look at a number of large stimulus packages that have been introduced in recent years. So first off, I guess before we get into sort of how this moves into some of the Canadian economies, just looking at some of the stimulus news that's come out recently. So you can see some of the news articles that have taken place here. The graph on the left there is essentially showing how interest rates have taken place across some major economies, and you can see that many of them have pushed it down to zero, or in some cases even below zero. And the map on the right there is actually showing the interest rates across Europe in a number of countries that have already breached the zero mark and actually have gone into negative interest rate territory. So Denmark and Switzerland showing up there as being negative 0.75% interest rates. The pink is minus 0.5 and the blue minus 0.25%. So quite interesting to watch this play out. There's some unprecedented things happening in the currency markets right now. But again, all of these things are taking place in order to keep economies functioning and continuing to see trade take place across the world. So one last chart I just want to share is the 10-year Canadian dollar. As you can see, we've gone sideways between essentially a 70 and an 80 cent range. So again, that's pegged relative to the US dollar. We've been going sideways for quite some time here at a lower range than where we were at prior to the 2015 timeframe. And as we're looking at that range, the fluctuations within it are impacting the basis values. They're also impacting, for many of you, decisions that you're making around major purchases, perhaps of equipment, or even some financial instruments such as options to help manage your risk. Because if we're looking at wheat, for example, when you go and buy a call option or a price minimum price put, some of the Cargill solutions, you're paying for those in U.S. dollars, but also the gains that you're experiencing, or the money that you're getting back as you sell those, is also in U.S. dollars. So as we apply this knowledge to your farm, there's a few points that are just really important to think about. First is the natural hedges do provide some offsets in agriculture. So a natural hedge would refer to, for example, equipment. If the Canadian dollar goes down, becomes more expensive, but typically the basis levels are going to go up higher. As well as the Canadian dollar drifts lower, it can make the commodity cheaper to the countries that are buying it, and thereby increase demand. So there's some natural offsets that occur in agriculture, which is important to realize, that not every currency risk needs to be hedged out. It can also just be managed by looking at the farm on as a whole. One of the tools we have to do that is the Farm Maximizer. It helps you to understand your costs and margins. And I would encourage you, for those of you who are looking at using that tool for the upcoming crop year, to be accurate and to put those figures in there, because it can really help in decision making and knowing what your currency impact is on your farm. And then from there also, like I said, managing your basis levels and understanding your minimum price options and the impact of currency on that. Again, talk to your advisor if you want to get more information on that. And finally, foreign exchange risk can be hedged as well. There are some mechanisms to do that. And if you, again, want more information on that, feel free to speak to one of our advisors, and they can help you better understand that. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining, and look forward to the year ahead. Thanks.